It's been well over a decade ago that a good friend of mine, Stephen Medford, told me that he enjoys driving his car without the radio on. No music, no audiobooks, no sports talk, no news talk, no singing to himself, just him driving. And he said at first it was a bit uncomfortable, sitting there alone with his own thoughts. And I think sometimes that would be us. We want that distraction of the radio on or something happening so that I don't have to think to myself, because sometimes we're uncomfortable with our thoughts. But he said with time he accepted it, that he was forcing himself to do that, and then he eventually began to enjoy it, and then ultimately he ended up embracing it, alone with his thoughts. And I think we have to ask the question, what was it that eventually made him embrace driving alone in his car with nothing on or nothing to distract him? And I think the answer is that his thoughts became better. They became clearer. They became more focused and more beneficial for him because they were more focused on God. And now when he is alone and driving, he feels more connected with the divine. And that's exactly how we should feel. And what he was actually describing, though he may not have used these words, but he was describing the spiritual discipline of solitude. The idea of silence and solitude that go hand in hand together. In our pursuit of holiness and imitating Jesus, we certainly ought to start practicing the idea of solitude. You know, some disciplines that we've already looked at, we've been readily familiar with, right? Study and prayer, those are things we know. Those are things we understand. We've been doing them probably all of our Christian life. But at the same time, there are others that we may have heard of but just haven't really practiced. Meditation and fasting and simplicity that we saw last week, these may be a little bit unfamiliar to us. When we think about them, there are hundreds of excuses why we don't want to try those things. But at the same time, there's only one reason why we should do them: to grow spiritually. That's the whole point of them. That's why God gave us those gifts. And so many of us, when we look at our lives, we see room for improvement or room for growth, right? I don't think any one of us would say, I'm perfect and I have no need to grow, or I don't have to change any. We all understand that there's room for growth in every one of our lives. And when we think about how we might grow, what are the avenues of growth, maybe it's some of these unfamiliar disciplines. Things that we've never tried before. You know what the definition of insanity is, right? Doing the same thing over and over, expecting a different result. And if we're in our spiritual lives, we feel a little cold or a little distant or maybe not as connected to the divine as we want to feel, and we just keep doing things that we've always done the way we've always done them, how could we ever expect to grow past where we are? I think we hit a certain plateau. And so we seek these spiritual disciplines. We seek these opportunities to grow with God. And so tonight we're going to talk about solitude. And I guess the first thing would be, what is solitude? You know, when I think of solitude, I immediately think of Superman in the Fortress of Solitude, right? You remember when he was a teenager, and he, in the Christopher Reeves version anyway, and he went to the Arctic, and he had that crystal, and he threw it as far as he could, and whenever it landed in the snow, it built this ice fortress for him, and he would go there whenever he needed to be alone. And you can imagine Superman, the psychology of a man who is saving the world, as it were, according to the comics, and how he would need a certain respite, a place to go and find solitude. And solitude then is this inward fullness of God. You know, sometimes I think we are afraid to be alone. Certain times in our lives, maybe that fear is greater than at others, but many times we don't want to be alone. I don't know if it's because we don't want to be alone with our thoughts. I don't know if it's we don't want to be alone because we don't want to die alone. But for whatever reason, a lot of times we fear loneliness. Solitude, however, is not loneliness. You see, loneliness is being alone and separated with an inner emptiness, that there's nothing here with me. Solitude is being alone with an inner fullness, the fullness of God. So there's a distinct difference between loneliness on one hand and solitude on the other. Both involve being alone, But in the case of solitude, we're talking about filling with the divine. And so that's the inner fullness that comes with solitude. We might also say that solitude is the separation from life. Many of you are probably old enough to remember the old Calgon commercials. You remember the Calgon, take me away. The idea was that the person is in the hustle and bustle of life, and it's got them down. Why? Because life gets busy. Life gets chaotic. Life gets loud, right? Everywhere we look, life is competing with God. And so in the commercial, the answer was, Calgon, take me away. Take me to this place of solitude, even if it's just for a few minutes, to be disconnected from the world. And so between play dates and ball games and practice and laundry and school and dinner and grocery shopping and laundry and recreation and cooking and house cleaning and laundry and bunco and laundry, sometimes it's difficult to find time for that spiritual growth. I have found that no matter what we put in life, life is always going to try to squeeze in a little bit more. And that's not to say the things that life wants us to do or that this world wants us to do are necessarily or inherently bad. Many of them are good things. But when we put too many good things in our lives, we don't have time for the best thing. And that's the danger. And so we often delude ourselves into thinking that we can do many other things while we practice spiritual formation. It's true that we can walk and talk, or we can walk and chew gum at the same time, we might say, but it's also true that we need some dedicated time of spiritual focus. I realize we can drive and pray. I'm not saying we can't. Jesus prayed with his disciples quite often, but then what did he do at other times? He separated and went alone and prayed in solitude. And so we think about solitude as this separation from life, from that hustle and bustle that is around us. But solitude is also a time of listening to God, similar to meditation, contemplating his word, but where in meditation we're contemplating the application of his word. In solitude, we're really refocusing the orientation of our lives, that we're looking to God and we're asking questions like, what will it look like in my future with God? What is it that he desires me to do? What does he want from me? Or a question I think a lot of times we're afraid to ask, what do I want from God? It's a valid question. What do I want from my relationship with God? And so in moments of solitude, we use this time to think about those particular aspects. Now again, we're not expecting some whisper from God to tell us or give us the answer to those questions, but what we are expecting is clarity and the ability to focus on what we know from the Word of God and what we know from the world. Sometimes I think we're afraid to think past the page. In other words, we read a scripture and it means exactly that, but we never ask, what does that look like in the 21st century in Sam Dilbeck's life, at the stage of life that he's in and what's happening? We don't want to think beyond that box of what the words on the page mean, but God didn't mean the page or the words on the page to be the life. God meant for the application of those things to my situation here and now. He meant for me to be asking those questions. What does this mean? How will this look in my life? And that takes some critical thinking. and having grown up in public education system and gone to school with a bunch of different people, I'm convinced that thinking hurts a lot of people. I think there's a physical pain that some people have in thinking. I know that thinking brings physical exhaustion because we have to put time and effort into it, but that's the idea that we're seeking to apply these things, and that means thinking outside the letter on the page and looking at it as the word on the heart. And that's part of what solitude is for. It's not merely the application of the word, but the outcome. What's it going to look like? What does God want from me? Solitude. Solitude is a time, I think, of spiritual recovery. How much abuse does your spirit endure on a given day or a given week? You know, the Bible speaks of Lot in 2 Peter 2, verses 7 and 8, says that righteous man's soul was vexed within him, right? And the idea is that his spirit is being abused by the sin and the debauchery and the things that he sees around him. Are we any different? Is our soul less vexed because of the sin that is around us? Well, of course not. Our spirits are being hammered, barraged. And what solitude does is it allows us to take a moment away from the battle, as it were, and let our soul heal, to rejuvenate, to recover. And I love that imagery, and that's the concept of solitude. And of course, we have the perfect example of solitude in Jesus Christ himself, right? Just after he is baptized, you'll recall that the Spirit drove him into the wilderness. For 40 days he fasted. 40 days and 40 nights he's fasting, right? But notice he's all alone. And the angels are ministering to him, but the angels are ministering to us as well. You know, in our moments of solitude, we don't see them. I don't know that he was having conversations with the angels. The Bible just says they ministered to him. It's the same words that talks about what the angels do for us. And so I'm not sure that there was anything other than solitude for Jesus on those 40 days. And then as soon as the 40 days are over, it says that he's hungry and the devil comes and tempts him. You think about what Jesus is doing in those 40 days of, yes, he's fasting, but in these moments of solitude, I have to believe that he's strengthening his spirit. He's getting prepared, not just for this battle with the devil, but for the entire ministry he's about to embark on. Because it's immediately after he's defeated the devil in Matthew chapter 4, verses 14, 15, and so forth, it says that he went out preaching the gospel concerning the kingdom of God. In other words, as soon as all of that was behind him, he started his ministry. And so he's strengthening, he's getting ready for that. Jesus went into solitude just before he selected his apostles. Luke chapter 6, beginning in verse 12. In these days he went out to the mountain to pray, and all night he continued in prayer to God. And when day had come, he called his disciples, and he chose from them 12, whom he named the apostles. And so before selecting his apostles, Jesus spends time alone in prayer. We've seen him alone in fasting. Now we see him alone and in prayer. What a wonderful example that is for us. Seeing him as he's preparing to make, this is a huge decision. Who were going to be his 12? Who was going to be the one that he chose that would eventually betray him? Do you think Jesus had those moments in view of what he was going to endure and how he needed to rely upon these 12 when he's selecting them? Of course he is, and I think he's thinking about those very things. In Matthew chapter 14 and verse 12, it says that the disciples, or John's disciples, came to Jesus, or came and took the body of John and buried it. This is when he's been beheaded. And it says they went and they told Jesus. So John the Baptist that had baptized Jesus was a near kinsman to him, has now been killed, and Jesus just gets news that they've killed and John, and he's been buried. And notice the very next verse. It says, now when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a desolate place by himself. He's all alone. He's taking time to mourn the passing of a friend, a relative, a soldier of God. And he says, I'm going to go and be alone for a little bit. Jesus went into solitude after ministering to the multitudes. We see this many times over. Matthew 14, just a little bit later, he's fed the 5,000, and he's sent his disciples across the lake, the Sea of Galilee. He's dismissed the crowd, and it says in Matthew 14:23, after he had dismissed the crowd, he went up on the mountains by himself to pray. Ministry in and of itself, is an exhausting work. It always has been. Preaching the Word, teaching the Word, interacting with people, it's exhausting. I've got a friend of mine who he's a preacher, but he's an introvert. And, introverts get exhausted being around people. And for him, just a Sunday around people, he can't hardly keep his eyes open at the end of a service, because it is draining on the introverts that way. But then he goes and he rests. He spends some solitude by himself, rejuvenates, and he's ready to go back on a Sunday night or on a Wednesday night. That's part of what we're talking about. Jesus, in his ministry, finds time to separate. In Mark 1, verse 32, that evening at sundown, they brought him all who were sick and oppressed by demons, and the whole city was gathered together at the door, and he healed many who were sick with various diseases and cast out many demons, and he would not permit the demons to even speak, because they knew him. And rising very early in the morning, while it was still dark, he departed and went out to a desolate place, and there he prayed. You see, it was Jesus gets exhausted. His spirit gets exhausted. And he has to go and spend time in solitude for that rejuvenation. When the disciples were sent out on the limited commission, they come back and they're extremely excited, and they're talking about all the things that they were able to do in the name of Christ and the power of God. And as they're just excited about these things, in Mark chapter 6 and verse 30, it says that the apostles returned to Jesus and told him all that they had done and taught. And he said to them, "Come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest for a while." For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure, not even to eat. And they went away in a boat to a desolate place by themselves. Jesus not only understood this for himself, he understood it for the apostles. It's great that you've been able to do these things, but let's go take a little bit of rest. This morning in class, John Nason, of course, asked the question about, are we sinning by sins of omission if we're watching Golden Girls instead of studying our Bibles? Because decidedly, studying our Bibles is a more spiritual activity than the Golden Girls. Well, let me ask the question this way. Was it a sin of omission for these disciples to go away to a desolate place for a little while to rest after their ministry? I think if it was, then Jesus is the leader of that sin, isn't he? Because he's the one that says, let's go away. And they go away. In preparation for the cross, Jesus went with them to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, "Sit here while I go over there and pray." And taking with him Peter and the two sons of Zebedee, he began to be sorrowful and troubled. Then he said to them, "My soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch with me." And going a little further, he fell on his face and he prayed, saying, "My Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will." Matthew 26, 36 through 39. Jesus is facing the most difficult hour he would face on this earth. The cross itself, and in preparation of the cross, just as in preparation of the ministry, now in preparation of the cross, he goes to the Garden of Gethsemane. Remember the garden of the oil press, or the olive press? And he's there, and he separates from the 12, and he takes with him just 3 others, and he separates from them and goes a little bit further. He's alone in the garden, and he only asks them, "Watch with me while I pray." And of course, you know the story, they fall asleep, and Jesus is even more alone in his darkest of hours. If Jesus, the Son of God, the creator of the universe, the sinless one, the perfect one, needed time of solitude, what does that say about us the imperfect, the weak, the sinful, not the Creator, but the creation. What does it say about us and our needs for time away? What do we stand to gain if we start to practice times of solitude? Well, I think in these examples of Jesus, we see clearly that we can gain strength for the ardor of Christian living. Christian living is not the default of humanity. Otherwise, everyone would be good people, right? We wouldn't need jails. We wouldn't need prison. We wouldn't need punishments of any kind. But it's not the default for humanity. We tend to make bad decisions. And so living Christ is not the easy choice. It's the harder choice. And in preparation for that life, we need to spend some time in solitude, thinking about what this life is going to be. I think clarity in decision-making is another impact that we can have in solitude. Trying to erase the distractions for just a moment. And maybe I've got a big decision at work, whether I take a new job, whether it's time to move to another place. These are things that they're big decisions. And they don't just impact me, they impact everyone in my life, everyone in my sphere of influence. Family and friends and co-workers. And to have clarity for a moment might come to us in that solitude where Jesus found it for himself. Comfort in times of mourning. We've all lost friends and loved ones, and just as Jesus lost John, and here he goes and he finds time to be alone. Maybe he's contemplating what it was like to be with John, maybe as a child, or maybe in those first days of his ministry, thinking about the work which John had done and the benefit that he'd brought to the coming of the new law. A replenishment after ministry and sacrifice. Seek solitude for that. Fellowship with those of like precious faith. I like that, in the case of the disciples coming back from the limited commission, they go away together. It's a retreat, a spiritual retreat together in fellowship. Why? Because even though they're not technically alone by themselves, they are together as a group alone and separated from the world, and they're gaining benefits that way. Preparation for hard times. Solitude can help prepare our hearts and our minds for those moments. And so, where do we find our fortress of solitude? I think number one, we can focus on the little moments throughout the day. Maybe you wake up before everyone else in the household, and maybe you can get a cup of coffee and sit and think. Maybe that's your moment of solitude. And maybe you don't even get out of bed. Maybe you're just awake and you're laying there, and you start focusing on what this day is going to look like with God in it, right? Wasn't it James who said you ought to say, if the Lord wills, I will go here and there and buy and sell and get gain, or do this or that. If the Lord wills. And so we contemplate our day. I always think about the things that I have to do today before I even get out of bed. And I'm thinking about ways in which I can use those moments to glorify God. And so that's that question of, what does God want from me? And that's part of the solitude that we might find. Or maybe it's your morning drive time. If you drive for 30 minutes or an hour to get to work and you're in bumper-to-bumper traffic, as it were, maybe you use that time alone. Turn off the radio and be alone with your thoughts about you and God. Number two, we might find or make a place of quiet solitude. I like in Matthew 6 and verse 6 in the great Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says that when you pray, go into your room and shut the door and pray to your Father who is in secret. And there's obviously a picture there of a place to go where you're alone. You're going into this, some translations say, into your closet, into your secret room, into your special place. It is true that we associate a lot of feelings and a lot of emotions with things like smell and sights and places. If you've ever driven by some place that you used to go to as a teenager, and it kind of brings back those memories that you had of when you were a teenager, right? And it might have been a few years ago, or it might have been for Ivan, it was like 12 decades ago or something for Ivan, but it may have been a long time ago. But the point is that going to a certain place helps set our minds and our hearts for an activity, right? So pick out that place, make it special, and use it just for your moments of solitude. And it might just be a chair in the corner of your bedroom. But every time you go to that chair, use it as a time of solitude. You might be able to build a she shed in the backyard, right? Use that as your place of solitude. Those are wonderful ideas and certainly things that we can do. One thing that Foster, in this particular chapter, he links solitude and silence together. The idea of speaking few words, using solitude to focus not just our hearts and our minds, but focus how we're going to communicate with other people. He likens the idea of speaking. He says a lot of times we speak because we're afraid people will misunderstand us. Well, they'll misunderstand an action that we did, and so we feel obligated to justify and rationalize and explain why I did this way at this time. And so we expand our words, and of course he even recommends, and I don't know that I agree with this, but he recommends picking a day and fasting from words. Don't speak. I don't think that that's necessary, and I'm not sure even how that would be helpful. But I do like the idea of using an economy of words. I think Jesus said it this way: let your yea be yea and your nay be nay, right? And isn't that the same idea? Or James said it this way. He said, let everyone be swift to hear and slow to speak and slow to anger. Measured words. Well, how do we do that? How do we get to this place of measured words? Well, it begins with a certain solitude that we embark upon in this life. Number 4, we might take time to periodically go away. Not a vacation, but a pursuit of spiritual renewal, a reorientation in our lives. I think sometimes we start to veer from the way to the left or to the right. Isn't that what God told Joshua? Keep this book of the law ever before you. Do not turn from it to the right hand or to the left hand. Look, if Joshua, who is God's servant, who is being communicated with directly from God, has the potential to turn to the right hand or to the left hand, what does that say about me? Do I not have that? And so maybe our time of solitude is to reorient ourselves so that we're back on track again, to refocus our lives. Jesus spent 40 days preparing for ministry. How do you prepare for your work? And look, your work, it doesn't matter if you're a ditch digger, if you're a burger flipper at McDonald's, or whatever it is that you do for a career. It is part of your ministry because you're going to engage with people. And that engaging with people needs to be one where you're a representative of Christ. We're not just at a job to make money. We're at a job to show Christ. How do you prepare for that ministry every day? Each year, the elders where a friend of mine, Eddie, works, gives him a week off to go and spend time in solitude. There's a member of the church where he is that owns a ranch, and it has a cabin on it with full electricity and plumbing and everything. It's a really nice little retreat place. And Eddie goes there, and he stays an entire week. And what he does is he plans his sermons, and he spends time in prayer, and he reads his Bible, and he comes back rested. And the idea is he's got a plan of sermons for a year now, and he's prepared to preach. Another guy I know in the elders where he preaches, after he'd been there 7 years, gave him a month sabbatical. Why? It was for him to renew his spirit so that he could engage more faithfully in the work. We need to recognize that as we minister for Christ, and whatever job it might be, we need time for renewal. And that's the solitude that God has given to us. So the idea would be, if I were given solitude, where would I go? Where would you go for your moment of solitude? When could you do it? How long could you stay? You know, a lot of us, we think about solitude and taking a break from the world. We can get 10, 15 minutes in. We got to check Facebook. We got to check see if anyone's emailed me. We got to check the scores on the game. Who won? Or who cares? Where would you go? How long could you stay? I think it would be good for us to set time to disconnect. And maybe we don't have the time or the place or the finances to go for 3 or 4 or 5 days somewhere and just find solitude. Maybe that's not us. Maybe we've got little ones we've got to take care of. We've got a job that's got to pay the bills. I understand. But maybe we can pick a 3 or 4 hour window sometime in the next couple of weeks to just be alone. And find solitude in those small moments, but also look for that time to be completely away, where there's no phone and no TV and no books and no golf and no fishing. You think, fishing? I don't know about you, but halfway through the day, if you've not caught anything, it's pretty frustrating fishing. We don't need the frustrating. And I don't know about you, but if you go golf, it's pretty frustrating after the first tee off hole. For me, anyway. No people. Just you, your thoughts, and God. I see some faces longing for that right now. Oh, I wish I could be there. You can. We can all be there. We can all be renewed. We can all be strengthened. And we can all be better. Tonight, I do want to offer an invitation. Maybe you're one of those who's struggling with finding that connection with God, and you want to just come back, and maybe you don't want to wait till you can find a 3 to 4 hour time where you can be alone. Maybe what you need right now is the healing of God today in this moment. And so if you have a need to come to God or seek the encouragement and the prayers of the church here, we invite you to come while we stand and while we sing.